we're really genuinely excited about today's. I mean, we're always excited about the events, but there's something that feels really special about this one. You know, in the kind of days and the weeks leading up to our sessions, we try to immerse ourselves in the work of whoever's speaking or the topic. And with Pete, there's just such a range of delights that you can sort of enter into. I've been reading his book, Stage Invasion, which came out in 2019, and it's funny because I realized I had some kind of subconscious assumptions. Like, I expected it to be really great, but when it was like really great, I noticed myself being sort of surprised. And I think it's because he does such a multi-talented entity, you know, sort of poet and musician and activist, and you know, you can read poems or read research or like listen to albums, and it's that sort of like disbelief that someone doing so many things can do them all so well, but he just truly does. And it's a real like multidisciplinary book. And you know, in the Western culture, we always sort of celebrate specialists, or we have historically, but this book, it has such a wide wingspan around you know, performance and language and sort of psychology and people and like there's so much in it. And it's when you realize that what you're reading is sort of the tip of the iceberg of what sort of went into a work like that. It's just really impressive. Yeah, I have to confess that I've always been a bit intimidated by poetry. You know, every time I sort of find myself in the situation where someone's going to read a poem, I often have this kind of little sort of, I have to have a word with myself, because it's like my knee-jerk reaction is like, oh my God, am I going to understand anything? Am I going to be able to relate to anything that's said? You know, as though I'm about to listen to like a 2 hours of like theology and like Old English. And this kind of fear, it's been definitely easing since spending more time with Roz, who we do Semantrix together. You know, Roz is a real sort of pathological poet. Yet I still have to remind myself that poetry isn't this kind of exclusionary high art, that it really has been reclaimed and revitalized, you know, much like art becoming sort of street art and graffiti and tattoos, or like charity shop fashion. I'm just going to let Pete enter now, and it's just with absolute pleasure that we welcome him. Yeah, renowned spoken word artist, author, activist, songwriter, researcher, educator. Very warm welcome, Pete.
Bless you. Thank you for that wonderful blessing introduction, Rianne. Really lovely to be here. Hello, everybody. And yeah, I want to take the privilege of this mic also just to celebrate the fact that Semantrix is bringing together two of my favorite things: psychedelics and language, linguistics, poetry. All these things is a really vital combination, I think, at this point in history of our species, and also of the psychedelic renaissance and our relationship with language as a culture. So it's with great delight that I get to give this, and with some indulgence that I get to give this presentation. And it's kind of really a download of my poetic. So I'm going to just do a quick screen share here so we can get this. I've got some slides I'm going to share with you. Here we go. There we go. So Technicians of Reenchantment is a new educational project that I'm unfurling on a variety of different levels, whether that's private tuition. Also, I'm putting together a course as well, which is a course in the applied poetics of contemporary bardcraft, which I think is something which is really vital to revitalize, as Rianne was saying, not just poetry, but also society. And as a spoken word artist, I'm very interested in what my role is within the ecology of artistry and social life that I inhabit, and what my function is. And anyone who knows any poets knows that they're not just writers and performers. They're lots of different things. We're going to be delving into that. We're going to be looking at the importance of that. We're going to be looking at the word re-enchantment and what that means in the 21st century. We're going to be looking a little bit of the genealogy of this as a philosophical concept, and we're going to be relating this to poetry specifically, and we're going to be inflecting it towards the oral tradition and the contemporary emanations of that tradition or traditions. So that's what I'm going to do. And I'm addressing this really to everybody, and I'd like everybody to feel, whether or not you consider yourself a poet or into poetry, that this belongs to you. I'm sure everybody has their favorite poets, whether they're a rapper or a singer or whatever it is. Everyone has their favorite bard, and everybody has a living relationship with language, whether you're a writer or a performer or somebody, a human that speaks words. This belongs to you, and the invitation is for you. I mean, I'm going to be talking about mostly poetry, but the invitation is for you to consider the word re-enchantment and to integrate that to your own life, your own poetic, your own lexicon of verbal artistry, your own life, your own creative endeavors, because it is a huge and really incredible concept. So this is going to be a whistle-stop tour of many different things. And really, I could do a talk on any number of the slides that I'm going to be showing you, any number of the topics that I'm going to be touching on, because the word re-enchantment is actually a governing principle of my life's work, and this is crystallized in the last year or so, as an educator and as a writer and performer. So before we do that, and I'm just going to illustrate the need for re-enchantment in the age that we're living in. I believe that we're living through an age of chronic and pathological disenchantment, and we're now in late capitalism, which is the final stanza of 5 centuries of scientism, rational empiricism, trade, urbanization, consumer capitalism, trends which have delivered us many things, but have also brought us to a place of existential threat and global collapse. What my friend Colin Tudge calls the converging tsunamis of social, ecological, and economic collapse. Okay, there is no poetry on a dead planet. Disenchantment is a real and very a threatening aspect of modernity. Disenchantment can be described as the opposite of abundance. It's a state of enervation. Nietzsche talked about he wrote about how all beauty incites procreation, and the opposite to that is ugliness. Ugliness is devitalizing, and it depletes what he calls the will to power. So I would also say that disenchantment is a desecration. It takes a sacred world and it makes it less sacred. It's an assault on the natural world, and it's also an assault on the creativity of that natural world, because it objectifies. It's a certain mindset of modernity which objectifies and dissects and disenchants the natural world to turn it into resources that can be exploited and destroyed. And part of that desecration is a desecration to human creativity. It's a desecration of the fireside tradition. You know, in the last 5 centuries, many things have been lost and desecrated in the name of profit and productivity, including oral traditions, languages, indigenous traditions, feminist law, which started with the witch hunts, of course, about 5 centuries ago, and all of the attendant ceremonial and ritualistic and holistic medicinal practices that come along with that, folk culture, the enclosure not just of our land but also of our time, our social time, our folk heritage, and enclosure of poetry. And I consider the last 5 centuries of capitalism to be a sustained assault on human creativity and a sustained assault on poetry. This is not a new concept. Disenchantment. Max Weber, who famously gave us the concept of the Protestant work ethic, which is, of course, the ethic of capitalism, of Western Anglo-Saxon capitalism. Part of his argument was that this is based on disenchantment. To quote Wordsworth, we murder to dissect. we murder to dissect. So that's a little bit of the historical moment that we're in. I don't want to dwell too much on this because we all know this narrative, and how terribly fucked we all are. But that's a little bit on the urgency of the situation that we're at. Now, I'm not going to go back 5 centuries. We could start at Shakespeare before the enclosures and this whole nascent project of capitalism begun. But and hopefully, and I'm anticipating and hoping that maybe Roz will touch on her masters in Shakespeare, and maybe we'll talk a little bit about that later on. But I'm actually going to start around about 250 years ago with the Industrial Revolution and humanity's psychological and aesthetic response to that, or part of humanity's aesthetic and psychological response to industrialization, which was Romanticism. Blake talked about the divine arts of the imagination. I know of no other gospel than the divine arts of the imagination. And all the Romantic poets were talking about the imagination, mysticism, the mind. Keats, Coleridge, Wordsworth, Shelley, all of them were talking about imagination as almost like a mystical, erotic, animating force in ways that were congruent with philosophies such as the Dharmic religions, Hinduism, Buddhism. They were the first Western generation to be seriously getting in and reading the Bhagavad Gita and the Upanishads and integrating that into their philosophy. They're also really into Greek paganism, so there's bits of animism in there as well. They're into psychedelics. Here in Bristol, they had the Pneumatic Institute where they were getting high on nitrous oxide and writing about it and integrating that into their poetry. This is a city where Wordsworth and Coleridge lived. Two poets I'm very, very into. Also, they were their politics was very revolutionary often. So the Romantics were kind of proto-hippies, and they were reacting to the disenchantment of their world and of their culture's cosmology through industrialization. So they were engaging with the imaginal realm through poetry and other arts. They were trying to defend the sacredness and the wonder and the mysticism of existence. Here is a beautiful quote from one of my favorite poets, one of the best people ever to grace the English language, Samuel Taylor Coleridge. "We become an anarchy of spirits, toy bewitched, made blind by lusts, disinherited of soul. No common centre man, no common sire knoweth, a sordid, solitary thing." I don't know if anybody else sees himself in this picture. There's part of me that sees myself in this. And this quote is really, really relevant to the loneliness epidemic and the mental health epidemic, of course. There are, since the Romantics, lots and lots of people who've been embellishing on the works of the Romantic and talking about enchantment specifically. R.G. Collingwood was a philosopher in the early 20th century, had a lot to say on this. There was the Eranos school of authors and researchers, including Henri Corbin, the Islamic scholar, in the early 20th century. They were talking about, the Eranos school were talking about what they called the age of anxiety. And they were saying, look, European society has become deracinated. It's become uprooted from its source. It's technologized, it's decadent, it's alienated, and it's materialistic. Okay. Any of this sound familiar, right? Also, the Frankfurt school, mid-20th century, 1950s, 1960s, lots of Jewish, German academics and writers who went over after the Second World War to New York and came into contact with mass consumerism and mass entertainment. Many of them were Marxists, and they were talking about the effect on the psyche and the bleaching of the depth and the vitality of the human condition that mass consumerism was rendering on the human psyche. Also, Walter Benjamin, Eric Fromm, Herbert Marcuse. All of them were talking about disenchantment in their own way. So this is by no means a complete genealogy of the philosophy of disenchantment or re-enchantment. And I'm sure everybody here could perhaps find somebody that they've read that could add to this canon, this lineage. But the fact that this is a very old idea doesn't make this a cliche, and it doesn't make it a tired narrative. Actually, this gives us a very rich inheritance to draw on and to build on. And now, as we've seen, this is more urgent because the dark satanic mills, which Blake was reacting to, has tumored into late capitalism and all of the threats that come along with that. So it's with this history that I'm adding my own words to. To quote from my friend Anthony Anaxaguru, we're going to be shooting into the future with all of the ammunition of the past. Beautiful quote. Shooting into the future with all of the ammunition of the past. And the invitation is not just to re-enchant our language, but to re-enchant everything, because like capital, disenchantment permeates, pervades, and suffuses all aspects. This is how power works, of course, all aspects of our lives. This is a quote from the brilliant John O'Donoghue. Modern spirituality and psychology are full of loneliness. Much of it is the fruit of emptiness. It is not grown naturally from minds conversant with the eros of the earth. Loneliness lacks the rhythm and the belonging of a true ecology of the heart. It has a hunger at its core that inevitably breeds narcissism and the mechanics of relentless self-observation. Beautiful quote that speaks very much to the digital age that we're living in. So something I was going to say there, I'm not going to say now, I'm going to say later on. So I'm going to just bank that. Here we go. So here's a little, here is a definition of enchantment that you'll find on the internet or in the Oxford English Dictionary: a feeling of great pleasure or delight and a state of being under a spell or magic. That's great. And that speaks very directly to poetry, but it's not quite enough for what we're looking at here, the lineage and everything that goes into that word re-enchantment. So I thought, okay, well, I'm going to give my own definition of the word re-enchantment. And it started with a paragraph and it ended up getting quite long. And I decided that I didn't want to do a definition, because the thing is with definitions, it's kind of like that taxonomical impulse is the English disease. It's a kind of colonial mindset of dissecting and defining, and it's a very literary it's the mindset, definitions are what literate societies do, right? And that's not really quite what we're knocking at here when we're talking about re-enchantment. So I wanted to give a definition, and I wanted to flesh this concept out in a way that was a bit more enchanting. So here we go. Re-enchantment, an incantation. Re-enchantment is the spirited response to chronic alienation, boredom, and depression. From the epidemic of mental ill health and loneliness, our ancient longing for enchantment bodies forth with renewed vigour. Its remit is all at once physical, psychological, aesthetic, and numinous. Re-enchantment calls for a poetic mode of perceiving and conceiving. For too long, the materialist mindset has dissected the sensorium in which we dwell. As the meaning crisis deepens to a state of nihilistic despair, re-enchantment incites us to transcend the dull regime of postmodern cynicism. It is time to re-engage with the imaginal realm and celebrate the play that animates existence. What is being called for is an active maneuver towards beauty in all arenas of human endeavour and intrigue. Re-enchantment sings of the desecration of life and the relationship that makes us peaceful and well. This is a song of reverence, revelry, and relentless hope for an age of rupture and collapse. There is no enchantment on a dead planet. May our future be re-enchanted. So there we go. And then, if you'll indulge me, I went a bit further. I'm like, okay, well, I'm actually going to write a poem. I just started writing one this week, and normally I wouldn't share something that I've only just started writing this week, but in honor of one of the things I like about performing poems is that it incentivizes and it energizes the editing process. So being the prospect of coming before an audience, as I am with you now, helped bring this poem into life, and made me finish it or get it to a place of being ready to perform. So in honor of the fact that this is in a stage of its life cycle where it's very much alive and it's spiraling, I am going to share it with you in a way that I normally wouldn't do. So here's a little poem. It's work in progress. It doesn't have a title. Here we go. Enchantment hang on, can I actually see this? I might have to get a bit closer to the screen. Enchantment, the rippling mystery glistening through the hyphenated mycofibers of this god-bodied space creature. Enchantment, the means and the end of a cosmos, seducing itself to become a convulsive epiphany of possible beauties, enchantment. The dilating aperture of wow, enchantment. The pulsation of breath in each cell, enchantment. The unfathomable motive of the seething, shape-shifting freestyle of the microbiome, enchantment. The muse of the muse of the muse, enchantment. The rose, the fragrance, the kiss, enchantment. An existence enthralling itself to unravelment. Enchantment, the beginningless field of longing. Enchantment, the bewitchment of desire, enchantment. Enchantment, the co-curation of meaning in a mirrored mosaic of broken glass, enchantment. The poem read once in a dream, with objects and photos and tears from your life, sifted from the psyche's priceless detritus, see, the glistening mirage of the mind's dark web, the 6 dimensions of spiraling text, the most flattering, disturbing, invasive of scenes, leaving you scratching your head, your skin, your notebook, your canvas, your heart, your future, your past. To the ever receding horizon of home, to the infinite regress of hope and love, to the mysterium's entangled foliage, go. A song calls you in. It keeps disappearing. It is just within, just within. So there you go. That's a little poetic rendition of the concept of enchantment. This is one of my favorite poets here on the left, David Lee Morgan, who also just happens to be in the room. Excuse me while I flatter you, David. Beautiful photograph here that captures some of the energy of orature, the oral counterpart to literature, the oral tradition, as it currently stands in modern spoken word or performed verse. David Lee Morgan, check out his work, brilliant firebrand orator. When I first came across him about 15 years ago, blew me away. He was turning Marxist dialectic into these emotional, intellectual, compelling, long-form performance poetry pieces, and has since gone on to do loads of other very daring things, including translating Bangladeshi ancient mystic poetry and turning them into incredible performances. So very exciting. So thank you, David, for your work. Oral poetry. Now, it's very difficult to turn oral poetry or poetries or the oral traditions into a bullet point list because it's as old as humanity itself, right? Also, when we're talking about the oral tradition today in our society, we have to remember that we are a literate society, which comes with a whole psychodynamic, which is very other to a pristine oral society that has had no contact with text, right? So, but there are certain things that I think that we can say about oral poetry today and how it relates to textual poetry and how it relates to what it means for us today, right? So it's embodied. It's relational, yeah. It's in the room. It's long form. It's a different design to poetry as it's taught in our educational institutions. It's not economical and distilled, and it doesn't obey the same forms. Okay, it's usually semi-improvised because the performer is relating to the audience in the moment and what's going on in the room, and that's part of the craft of oral poetics. It's very musical, not just in the way that it sings. I mean, that last poem I did, you know, it is an example of an incantation, right? It's iterative. It's got that kind of that anaphora, that repeated phrase at the beginning of each line, enchantment. It's got that, you know, that kind of the use of the refrain is very common in oral poetry. So it's musical in that sense, but also oral poetry has always interacted with music and instruments. It's actually inseparable from it. And the idea of a recital or a reading is a phenomena of a literate society. Most oral poetry throughout history and around the world has been sung, because that's how you would publish your poetry. If this is this is a fireside tradition, if you're using your body to publish your poetry, you would sing it, and you would accompany it very often with instruments as well. So inherently musical, and it's eventive. It's about the live event. It exists. That is the ecology in which it publishes itself. That is how it substantiates and instantiates itself. An eventive art form. I would say that it's inclined towards relevance and relatability because of that eventive relational nature of it. It's democratic. Anybody can do it. You don't need to have, you don't have to know the canon. You don't even have to be able to read. You can be dyslexic and be an incredible performance poet. So in that sense, it's democratic. And it's founded upon an applied agency of the poet as entertainer, facilitator, educator, and ceremonialist, to name just a few. Okay, this is not about somebody sat in an English department or an academic institution or a publishing house. This is the networked poet being in service to their tribe in whatever, their community in whatever way that is needed. We often see poets being asked to do ceremonies for weddings and whatever it might be, in the context of the kind of collapse of organized religion. It's founded upon there's a question mark here, founded upon the ethics of respect and sharing, question mark, because some people might say, actually, spoken word, there's nothing inherently leftist or alternative or nice and cozy. You know, you can have praise poets that are celebrating chieftains, or, you know, poetry is very often used, you know, in recent years it's been used in adverts to celebrate banks and even, you know, Jeeps and other companies like that, right? So in that sense, there's nothing inherently sherry or respectful about it. But I would say about the performance poetry, spoken word, live poetry culture, certainly as it exists in the West, is that it very much does have as a defining feature that it is about respect and sharing. And in the context of the polarization and the race to extremes that we're rabbit holding ourselves into in this digital environment of everything that's going on, that I think is of great value and is the antithesis to this hatred which is engulfing us. I really strongly believe that, as somebody who's been involved in education and getting people to share about their lives and creating artistic community in schools and getting people to respectfully listen to whoever's, and then getting up and telling their own story. I do think that these activities are intrinsically antithetical to things which are happening. I was in London, got out of the station at Victoria on Saturday on my way to Brighton for a gig, and there was a fascist rally there, and I was in the middle of a fascist rally, and it was really deeply disturbing. And all these people brought together by hatred. That was the overwhelming affective signature of that rally, was hatred. And I think these types of activity are part of the antidote to that. So the oral tradition. I want to say a little bit more about how the oral tradition, what's happened to poetry really over this period that we're looking at. We're looking at the retreat of the fireside tradition. Poetry has become disembodied. It's become seen as a textual, elitist, academic activity, and something that's mediated by the page. We've lost the relationality, that fireside tradition that we've been talking about. The erosion of poetry by the prosification of the Western mind. Okay, we live in a very prose-based society. It's very functional. It gets stuff done. It's not normal that we live in a society that doesn't really have much of an appreciation for society. That's quite unusual historically. Certainly, you go to other parts of the world, it's very unusual that we live in a culture that doesn't really appreciate poetry. And you could relate that to the economy and eclosion and Ian McGilchrist, from a neurological perspective, would say that, you know, this is a kind of takeover of the left hemisphere. I would agree with him. We've also seen an academicization, and I realize that the word academicization is itself a wanky academic word, right? But the academicization, the turning of poetry into an elitist specialization, is a form of enclosure. And then conversely, a very different form of enclosure, commercialization of poetry, turning it into to something that happens on adverts and gets used in that way. The relegation of poetry to an aesthetic timeout, so a loss of that, a loss of those motive, a loss of the things which were inspiring the romantics to write the poetries that they've done, I think is sorely lacking. And I think it's just about to come back in a big way into poetry, because we're experiencing a spiritual poverty as part of the disenchantment that we're all living through. And I think poetry has a role to play. So this is what we're facing in poetry, and this is kind of what we're combating. Words matter, and ancient wisdom traditions, all of them, see poetry, and they see language generally as magical, whether it's public or private, performative or textual, as magical processes that should be treated with reverence and approached selectively and with great caution, because we're a linguistically mediated species. Our psyches and the way that our brains communicate with each other is mediated by language. So you modulate language, you modulate consciousness, right? So here, of course, we have the eightfold noble path in the Buddhist tradition, and we've got right speech there, right near the top, number 3, mediating between our actions and our intentions and our perspectives. And there's a great metaphor used in Zen Buddhism, I think it was given to me by Thich Nhat Hanh, this metaphor of the seed bank. You've got a cellar. The mind is like a house, and in the cellar you've got a seed bank, and from there all of the foliage and all of the green stuff and the shoots engulf the upper floors of consciousness. So what is in our seed bank? What seeds are we putting in the seed bank in the cellar? What is growing out? What are we taking out of the cellar? What are we weeding out, right? And the linguistic health of our environment is one way that we're doing that. Poetry really, really big in Zen Buddhism. The idea of right speech is that the speech should be necessary, compassionate, and true. And the invitation for us is to ask ourselves before we speak: is this necessary? Do I need to speak at all? Is it compassionate, and is it true? Noble silence is another big thing in Buddhism, something which is treated with great reverence. So poetry, doing it well, doing it selectively, thinking about how we assemble them. Coleridge talked about poetry as the best words in the best order. Beautiful quote. Poetry is the best words in the best order. Poetry and language more generally is how we alchemize ourselves, and how in turn we alchemize the world around us. This is my own guru, my own teacher of Buddhist Dharma. His name is Rob Babaya, tragically died a few years ago, and is really big into poetry. The re-enchantment of perception is one of his key teachings. And poetry is one of the ways that he does that, not just to re-enchant himself and those around him, but also his soul-making Dharma, his particular take on the Dharma, is all about re-enchantment. And he's very into imaginal practice. He's very into working with dreams and the images that come out of visualizations, whether you're visualizing your energy body or whether you have images that come to you in meditation, and working with them, right? As a kind of poetic contemplation, and as a tool to work with the Dharma, a poetic way of working with the Dharma. So for Babaya, the images that come to us from our subconsciousness, or from the beyond of our sensorium generally, the external world, are ways of tracking, recording, and refining, and even sharing these images, and the ways that we relate to them, and the ways that we can modify them or understand them, both as individuals and as collectives, right? So poetry in this sense could be seen as a psychotechnology. And psychotechnology is a word that I'm borrowing from John Vervaeke, who is a cognitive scientist rather. And Vervaeke would say, look, meditation is a psychotechnology, and it's a tool that we can use to manage the mind. Okay. Interestingly, Vervaeke is very disparaging of the Romantics, and he said the Romantic movement, all they gave us was images and words. They didn't give us a psychotechnology, and I absolutely disagree with him, because poetry is a tradition, it is a discipline, and it gives us a way and a very available tool through which we can externalize our psyche and work with the images and refine and craft and ultimately share those images and those words in ways that have value and can change our lives and change the world around us. So absolutely, poetry is a psychotechnology. And to use a phrase of Bill Plotkin's, it's part of soulcraft. It's part of how we interface with the great subconscious and the internal world. So we're coming here towards what I would call a right relation of language. And it occurred to me when I was preparing for this talk that, often we talk about right relation. It's become like a buzzword, right, in alternative circles recently. And I think it's come out of a re-engagement with indigenous cosmologies, indigenous practices, the idea of right relation to XYZ, right, in a world that's so ruptured and broken down. And I'm like, and I looked for right relation to language. I'm like, can we have a right relation? Is anyone talking about right relation to language? I'm sure somebody has, but I couldn't find anything on the internet. So I ended up creating my own exploration of this. So here we go. This is my own. This is work in progress again, and maybe you guys can think of ways that we could add to this or modify this. But what might it be to have a right relation to language itself? Here we go. A right relation to language is a poetic engagement with speech as an ecology of symbols, images, patterns, and intentions that can evoke and connote numberless possibilities. Language is not merely a functional or stylistic tool, but a way to participate in the eternal stream of imaginative cognition on which existence is founded. This daily wealth of musical, creative, and relational play is the birthright of us all. Personal and social emancipation is achievable when we, in our own words, autonomously narrate our own worlds. This relationship to language recognizes the world-shaping power of words while being alive to the ways that words are infiltrated by power. It considers critical literacy to be an essential skill for the networked psyche of the modern world. What I want to encourage is a greater cultural perception of the linguistic health of our sensorium. May we cultivate language as an adequate vehicle for beauty, truth, and compassion. May we practice curiosity towards the language of others and act to protect the knowledge, wisdom, and identities inhabiting them as they face the threat of extinction. May we embrace ancient wisdom traditions that treat speech, text, and silence with reverence and ritualized attention. May our ultimate aim be to heal the grammar of our species and our relationship to the living language of our home. So that's a right relationship to language. And maybe you guys can email me like, you're wrong. Do this, add this. This is a working document. Here we go. So poetry estranges, it defamiliarizes cognition. It brings rupture and rapture to default cognition. It dehabituates and rehabituates the mind, and the mind, capital M. I'm a panpsychist, so I like capitalizing things like that. It dehabituates and rehabituates the mind, and the mind, this is a two-way process, the great psyche, the great unfoldment of imagination, creativity, and play that is existence itself. It re-enchants perception and conception. Poetry modulates consciousness, it alters our relationship with reality, it forges new connections, and it creates cognitive fluidity, play, and flow where there is rigidity and sedimented perception. Now, you'll notice here, and I'm sure that many of you have picked up on the fact that I'm purposely using language of the psychedelic Renaissance, because partly because I think that everything is psychedelic, because everything is the mind manifesting itself in a cosmos composed of which is essentially a mental event, but I'm not going to go down that little panpsychist digression right now. But poetry is very psychedelic, and poetry is actually right at the center of the psychedelic Renaissance. And this is why I love Semantrix, is because it's presencing the central role that poetry should take in the psychedelic Renaissance, especially when we're experiencing this medicalization, commercialization of psychedelics and all the forces and power that's coming in and trying to turn it into the same old bullshit. This is a graphic some of you may have seen before. It is the inventory of altered states of consciousness, and it's a brilliant way of creating a taxonomy and graphically being able to understand psychedelic experience. And you see here, and looked at through the lens of poetry, you can see here in the pink, you've got synesthesia, elementary imagery, complex imagery, the changing of meaning of perceptions. In yellow, you've got mystical encounters, spiritual experience, insightfulness. Here in blue, you've got the disillusion of the self. You've got madness. All of these are intrinsically poetic themes, and I don't know of a better way that you can engage with the ineffable than with a poetic language. It's not about prose. You can't engage with the ineffable through prose. You can only hint at it and connote it through poetic language. And that's why there is this ancient connection between mysticism and psychedelics, and mysticism and poetry, because poetry does give us a language that we can scratch at the edges of meaning, the way that meaning bleeds with poetry. I mean, personally, this is a subject very close to my heart because I write a lot of poetry after taking psychedelics. Maybe some of you have had similar creative journeys of your own. I've talked a lot about poetry, and I haven't actually read much poetry. So here's a poem from William Wordsworth, or a section of one of his poems in the Prelude, Book 2. Anyone who's taken mushrooms or DMT or whatever it might be able to relate to this passage. I think he was, in his own way, he was really tripping balls. I was only then contented when, with bliss ineffable, I felt the sentiment of being spread over all that moves and all that seemeth still, over all that lost beyond the reach of thought and human knowledge, to the human eye invisible, yet liveth to the heart, over all that leaps and runs and shouts and sings, or beats the gladsome air, over all that glides beneath the wave, yea, in the wave itself, and the mighty depth of water. One song they sang, for in all things I saw one life and felt that it was joy. Amen. Yes, psychedelic Renaissance is a poetic Renaissance. It is a shock therapy on human consciousness. It takes us out of the fragmented consciousness in which we find ourselves and brings us back to a state of wholeness. It's intrinsically religious in that sense, spiritual. It connects us to the mysterious, by proxy, the mystic and the sublime. And the result is enchantment. So here we go. I'm coming towards a conclusion here. So bringing all this together, what do I mean when I'm talking about the applied poetics of contemporary bardcraft? What am I doing here? Why am I wearing this wanky hat and going around climbing on stages? And like what do poets have to offer, right? Are we mere entertainers, or what are we bringing together? And there's a lot in here. You're not just creating. This is not just about poems. There's poems. You can poem. You can cantillate. This is kind of going on a continuum from kind of like more ecstatic, high energy stuff through to more kind of trance-like hypnotic stuff. You can cantillate, which is a beautiful way of saying singing. You cantillate, you chant, you recite, you sermonize, you inspirit, you praise, you enact rituals and ceremonies, you tell stories, you riddle, you bless, you charm, you incant, you invoke, you summon, you inspel, you dispel, you pray, you induce meditation, trance, magical dreaming, you hypnotize. These are the applied poetics of enchantment. This is part of what it is to be a bard. This belongs to all of us, no matter our background, our class, or whatever educational privileges we may or may not enjoy. This is part of what it is to be a healthy human being. This is part of what it is to have a healthy fireside, a healthy community, a healthy society. How can we adequately address the dying, the dispirited, the hospitalized, the beloved, or the beloved, capital B? And here is a list of just some of the technologies afforded to us by the oral tradition and by poetry, which I consider to be a kind of like an anatomical effusion. For me, poetry is an anatomical effusion. It's a physical event, physiological, eventive, dynamic flux that lives inside crowds, that lives inside bodies of bodies and passes like some ethereal wind through crowds. I love that. It's a magical, mysterious, and beautiful thing. And it's possible, you know, at poetry gigs. I've stage dived. I'm probably making myself sound more rock and roll than I actually am, but I've stage dived after doing a poem. People very often will wave their fist in the air. They'll cry after a poem or during a poem. They'll shout. A friend told me that she could listen to a recording of a lover reciting a poem to her, and this particular part of the poem every time would make her orgasm just from listening to it. So there are many things we can do with language, and these are powerful things. So that's basically the end of my talk, and I'm bringing all of this together into a course called Technicians of Reenchantment. I want more people to be technicians of reenchantment. It's going to be it's when I finally get it together, it's going to be a 6-week course. New worlds, rhetoric and satire, new gods, sublimity and mysticism, new mind, psychedelics and neologos, new bodies, trance, rhythm, voice, new hearth, ceremony and performance, new bards, the applied poetics in an age of collapse. Thank you for indulging me. That is my little download of my poetic. I hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you. The end. I'm going to end this share here. There we go.
That was absolutely spellbinding. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So much poetic language within it and through it, and even talking about the most prosaic elements of it, like phrases like the prosification of the Western mind. There's such a dynamism and a kind of lexical gymnastics that runs through the way that you present things, which is so perfect to the topic. It's absolutely dazzling.
Thank you so much. It's been really nice bringing together my research for this, actually, and for the course more generally, you know. There's more stuff I'd like to do as I flesh out these modules, but really interesting. There's so much such a wealth of wisdom hidden in the English language and in these traditions, and yeah, it's a great privilege to be able to spend time with it, really.
Yeah, it really was wonderful, and I sort of realized how close our research is. I mean, my whole PhD was essentially this topic, but getting that from a different angle with sort of different rhetoric and different phrases, it's like you sort of you remember, don't you? It's like we have to learn these things over and over again, and that whole talk, it was this like a process like, oh yeah, oh, like, you know, we have to learn these things over and over and over again. And I think maybe that's the point as well of sort of having, you know, integrating poetry into our culture.
It really did strike me at so many points, this parallelism between, particularly in Rianne's thesis, there's this grappling from different angles with why we're so stuck on this idea of what's ineffable, and I kept kind of coming back to it, and I actually wrote ineffabable in my notes.
Whoa.
Because it seems to come up so much. But it really made me think about in your the second song on your album, To the Man at the Dub Rig, there's this really interesting point where you go, don't speak, and you basically invite the listener to kind of bask in the beauty of the silence and the majesty of what's going on. And I'm kind of wondering about where your relationship with words sits in relation to that particular moment, because we've talked so much about the power of words and power of using them to verbalize something, but I'm wondering about that as opposed to silence.
Yeah, I mean, I wrote that. It's called To the Man at the Dub Rig because I wrote it at a dub rig in a trailer park here in Bristol. There was a dub night, and I was saying it to my friend Joe, talking about the dance floor being this kind of almost like a sacrament. Traditionally I've written a lot of poetry on dance floors, and to the point where I've had people like on drum and bass dance floors telling me off because I'm in the middle of the writing on notebooks. And dance floors are very places of mystical encounter, you could say, because you're in a field of ecstatic transport. You're in a field of music. You're in a river of sound that everybody is in. And it's very beautiful because, if you want to move through a dance floor, you have to let the dance floor move through you, right? You can't just walk through a dance floor. You've got to dance through the dance floor. So you've got to enter into the field of cognition that is the dance. And your neurology and your neurochemistry and the blood and the oxygen is you're in a heightened state when you're on a dance floor. So a lot comes out of that state of flow. I guess that's how I would relate to that. I think that's where that line, "Don't speak, don't even think about it," comes from. Yeah.
Do you make any distinction between writing poems and writing song lyrics, or are they the same thing for you?
There is a slightly different design because there's stuff you can get away with when it's a performance poetry piece that you can't do in a song. Generally, a poem will have longer words with more syllables. When you actually try to string it over a song, it just gets too muddy or it's too dense conceptually. So because you have control over the timing, so you can slow down in a poem and just give it space and break the meter, like like a song is like a scaffolding, and you've got to keep swinging at the same pace, and so you can break with that meter, and you can break and it just be a bit more dense, I find. But it is very similar. I mean, they're very related, I think, when it's performed verse and song. But you can go to different places. You can go to more interesting. That's why I stopped being a musician and became a spoken word poet, because it was not just musically and physically engaging, but it was intellectually and politically deeper. And I could go to different places with it, with the content. I guess you can go further with the content in a poem, I think.
Is that something that you find relates in really different ways to form depending on what you're talking about? Do you have a kind of instinct towards like lists or compound poems or kind of particular forms depending who you're working with or what you're trying to say?
Yeah, so I mean, the forms of performance poetry are less formalized. We don't. You can buy endless books on how to write villanelles and sonnets and sestinas and all the rest of it. But with in the world of performed verse, I think people are they're drawing on theatrical and comic and musical traditions much more. It's a hybrid art form. But because it's a performance discipline, so it's drawing on different traditions and different ways, So you could call a joke a form because it has a setup and a punchline, and it uses diction and it uses syntax in a particular way to give to release the energy along the line and to give a line its punch, to give a joke its punch. There's a form there. songs, of course, have that rhythmicity and that kind of structure, 4/4 beat very often. I mean, I'm using the term form very broadly here, but theatre and clowning is part of what poetry is. Poetry, of course, is a performing art, and it always amazes me how I have to keep on flying that flag. The idea that poetry is a performing art is alien, is an alien cultural assumption in a textual literate society, but it absolutely is for the long breadth of history, for the overwhelming majority of our history as a species. It has been a performing art, right? So within that, you've got, I guess, historically, it might have been in tribal societies considered spirit possession or channeling, or in clowning and theatre, you would call it, inhabiting a character. All of that for me is part of the design of what goes into poetry.
In your book, you just reminded me, you talk about slam, the culture of slam poetry, and how heckling is really integral to that. I was just wondering how does that look like, and like what does that teach?
Yeah, well, we were talking, weren't we, about like that relationality, and yeah, I remember an anecdote. I can't remember who the source was, but it was a poetry conference, and there was an African poet talking to a European poet, and the African poet said, the problem with you guys is you think because you're poets, everybody has to shut up and listen to you, right? So there was somebody from an oral culture where heckling was part of how poems were published. Sometimes that's formalized. So, for example, in Mayan, as in Central American Mayan poetic tradition, and also certain West African traditions, they have, as part of the performance, they have what's sometimes called an encourager, which is a planted heckler. And they co-sign, so they're like, yeah, hell yeah, tell it, that's right, yeah, and they're working with the poet to encourage the crowd and to have an agonistic, to be a protagonist to the poet. And that's part of how the poem is published. I always encourage and try to elicit noise and interaction from audiences, because it makes them alive to their role within the ritual, the game of literature. I think that's very important. And I think poetry dies and doesn't really go anywhere if we think we all have to politely sit there and endure poetry that has no attention either to the writing or to the performance or to the fact that there's an audience sat in front of them. I think that's it's really important that
it makes every telling unique as well.
Yes.
And I guess I thought heckling was just sort of people giving shit, but I guess I'm not. I don't know, maybe just a Manchester thing. I don't know.